A post from the American Heart Association has me a little bit up in arms. I'm going to explain why there might be some misinformation or disinformation from a certain post by the American Heart Association and why it caused me and a few colleagues of mine in the medical community to argue a little bit. This episode of the Earn It podcast. So let me just quickly read the post and I'll read some of the images. Again, there's going to be a link in the description of this podcast to this post. It was posted on LinkedIn. I'm sure the American Heart Association posted this on other platforms, but I'm going to just quickly read this real quick. During cardiac arrest, every second matters. That's why researchers are racing to build the next generation of life-saving tools to reach people experiencing cardiac arrest faster than ever before. Read on to discover how a new drug could help protect lives during cardiac arrest. You can help fund the next breakthrough that could save your life or the life of someone you love. For a limited time, your gift can go 5 times as far. Help save more lives. It's asking for donations for the American Heart Association. Now, I want to point to a very specific part of this post, and that is read on to discover how a new drug could help protect lives during cardiac arrest. So, new drug during cardiac arrest. What is this new drug? Well, let me quickly read a little bit more. It has this image. It says a nasal spray that could save your life. Life-saving discovery. During cardiac arrest, every second counts. Donors fuel research focused on delivering new life-saving drugs during cardiac arrest through simple sprays and auto-injectors. Okay. Lay people or first responders could quickly and easily give a drug that would protect the brain and save lives. Research like this helps protect lives in critical moments after cardiac arrest, and it's only possible because of donors like you. Okay. Now, I want you to reflect for a second. What do you think we're talking about? Does or does it not sound like the American Heart Association has some kind of new drug or nasal spray to use during cardiac arrest? And we should all know what cardiac arrest is, right? Cardiac arrest. The heart is not pumping. Your patient does not have a pulse. So we're talking about a nasal spray and or auto-injector for during cardiac arrest, are we not? Apparently, that's not the case. Apparently, this entire post is alluding to the nasal spray Narcan. And we should all, those of us that are listening to this and that are in the medical community, we know that Narcan does not do anything for cardiac arrest. If someone's heart is no longer beating and you give them Narcan, their heart will not give a shit. Nothing is going to happen to this person when their heart is already stopped. Now, if they're laying there and they're unresponsive, they're not breathing, but they still do have a pulse, and it's a high likelihood that maybe they are, experiencing an opioid overdose, then obviously it's reasonable to give Narcan. But I'm going to get into why this being this kind of public education campaign is actually more harmful for overdose victims in the first place, but I'm not going to get there quite yet. I'm getting to this seemingly misleading post and asking for donations. Now, I'm going to just be upfront. The American Heart Association, they get most of their funding through donations and through purchases of books. I myself love the American Heart Association. They have no doubt done a great amount for society as a whole. I don't even know how many lives the American Heart Association is responsible for saving. This has nothing to do with the American Heart Association. I also don't think they're just asking for donations so they can roll around in money and smoke a cigar and eat a fancy dinner. I don't think that's what's happening either. But when I read a post like this, I wonder what they're talking about. And then when I find out that they're just talking about naloxone, you should not be putting naloxone or Narcan in the same context as cardiac arrest. I'm sorry. That is unintentionally or intentionally, it sounds like it's misleading, in my personal opinion. Okay? So that's what's happening when I'm reading this. And this is being touted by people everywhere. And I maybe expressed myself a little bit in the comment section. And someone 10 times smarter than me responded, and then I responded back, and they have not yet had an answer for me because I'm sorry, there's not. Okay. And here's the thing, because another thing is they're educating, there's a big misinformation or disinformation or miseducation happening to the public and even medical professionals regarding overdoses. And I think that that's important to address at this time. I'm going to quote my comment here. My biggest issue with the narrative now is that people think there's only one way to intervene, and that's Narcan. And they have no idea that rescue breaths alone is enough. People standing around waiting on Narcan, meanwhile the patient is dying for no reason at all. Not happy about the AHA messaging on this. And then somebody replied, I'm not going to name drop anybody. I agree no one should ever be waiting on Narcan instead of starting CPR. However, asking an untrained layperson to provide effective rescue breaths is a pretty big ask, especially when that may mean putting their mouth on a stranger's mouth with vomit, blood, or secretions present. Research that informed AHA's hands-on only CPR recommendation also showed that lay rescuers can have difficulty giving effective breaths and that attempts at ventilation can interrupt compressions. Here in Birmingham, CARES data shows bystander CPR rates around 15%, which is significantly lower than the national average. While we work on that, giving bystanders tools they can use make a huge impact. Intranasal naloxone doesn't replace CPR, but it gives a bystander another way to help while EMS is on the way. Okay, let me explain this. I fully get but if simple CPR rates are that low, I can't imagine there will be a higher rate of success with an increased barrier, aka getting Narcan, learning to use it, and remembering it everywhere they go. We have taught hands-only CPR for so long, and rightfully so. That does not help the situation. I don't get the AHA's approach here. I don't see any critical thinking to this approach, just an idea that sounds good. Okay, so basically, here's the issue. Yes, it is a big ask to get strangers to put their mouths on strangers, but it's also a big ask to ask them to get a drug to reverse opiates and to carry it everywhere around with them. And they may or may not know some of the reactions that a patient will have after giving them Narcan and waking them up out of their opioid-induced slumber, which includes projectile vomiting on that person, and violence. Someone can get very aggressive and become violent whenever you wake them up suddenly. Now, is that an excuse like, oh, well, I'm going to just let them pass away because I don't want violence? No, that's not what I'm saying. But to pretend that introducing Narcan into the equation is going to somehow increase success rates, you are highly mistaken. So the national average, and this person was right, the national average is 41 to 42.5%. And this is for hands-only CPR. So again, what I think is that the success rates or the rate at which people will intervene and provide Narcan for somebody that is downed for an overdose is probably going to be a lot less than hands-only CPR. I'm just taking a big shot in the dark there. But again, obviously I can be completely wrong about that. But that's not the point. The point is also that I just think in general there is an issue with the fact that nobody seems to know that you can intervene before you have Narcan. In other words, it is perfectly reasonable to expect a group of bystanders and in the mix some medical professionals to be looking at someone that has a pulse but is not breathing on the side of the road or whatever. Maybe they have a needle in their hand still or it's in their lap, which, by the way, presents another danger. The scene has to be safe, right? And probably strangers aren't going to touch that and move it out of the way to make it safe. They're not going to know to make it safe, whatever. But the way that it currently stands is everybody seems to think that you just have to have Narcan in order to do something, which is not true. Before Narcan existed, the standard of care was that we would breathe for this person until the drug wore off. Now, obviously, that filled up a lot of emergency rooms with people with ventilators and ICUs, people that were just being ventilated and in the ICU just because they didn't have a respiratory drive, and that respiratory drive was going to definitely come back as long as there was no significant brain damage from hypoxia, which if there was, that person probably would have went into cardiac arrest first, but I digress. Assuming somebody just stopped breathing and were breathing for them, eventually, without any other medical intervention, that individual would wake up and they would no longer need to be ventilated, and they would leave the hospital. And what would end up happening, obviously the negative impacts from this was that we had less emergency department beds with, critical patients, because if you're on a ventilator, you're just a critical patient. And we had less ICU beds. So we had ICU and emergency departments flooded with people there for long periods of time. Narcan came on the scene. Obviously, it's a huge benefit because we don't have to keep people for multiple hours or days on a ventilator and give them, intense muscle relaxant and paralytics like, succinylcholine and so on and so forth to keep them on a ventilator until they woke up from their opioid-induced slumber. Okay, so Narcan is a net positive for the world. However, it's now become so ingrained in society that it is necessary in order to save somebody. And again, I understand there are two things can be true at once. One, it's unreasonable to ask somebody to give rescue breaths to a complete stranger, because if they're not carrying around Narcan, what makes you think they're carrying around appropriate equipment in order to give breaths without getting vomit or blood on them? Okay, that's also really important. But I just think that the emphasis and the focus on the Narcan is so intense that even a lot of medical professionals I talk to have no idea. They think that without Narcan, an opiate-induced overdose individual is going to pass away without the Narcan. These are trained medical professionals that I've spoke to. When I was in a class once when this was discussed, class full of medical professionals, I might add, and when it was discussed that, hey, if you don't have Narcan, you're just going to give rescue breaths because that's what we used to do, blah, 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 the whole spiel that I just went over with you, that was a surprise to everyone in the room. These are people that all worked in the medical field. These are highly trained medical professionals. Didn't even know that is a possibility. They thought without Narcan, you're screwed. That is not true. So on top of this being a misleading post, on top of this being kind of a mixture of information for whether it's on purpose or on accident, it doesn't matter. This information seems, in my personal opinion, to be misleading, especially to a layperson reading it. First of all, they're not even disclosing in this post that it's Narcan. I had to dig super deep and look at some of their campaigns and look on their website to find out that they were just talking about a Narcan nasal spray, which, by the way, there's nothing new about it. It's been existing for plenty of time, but also there's an education problem with the general public of thinking that it's 100% necessary. I'm a little bit surprised to see this posted. I'm a little bit surprised to see some of the comments that I saw. I was a little bit surprised to see some of the reactions that I saw, which was, oh, yay, hip, hip, hooray, and excitement and so much support because, obviously this should be supported. And if you are capable of donating to the American Heart Association, I highly recommend you do that because they do cutting-edge research. But Narcan nasal spray is not cutting-edge research. It's not anything that's new that the American Heart Association has just suddenly come upon and is suddenly going to start educating people on. Nor should they do this. Anybody that knows about Narcan or is going to go through the trouble of having Narcan with them at all times probably is an off-duty medical professional that might already do so. Only reason why I wanted to make a podcast episode about this is because something can seem really bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and good, and really beneficial, full stop, but isn't really what it seems to be. Make sure that whenever you're reading something or you hear somebody talking about something, you make a note and for you to form your own opinion on it at a later time. If you immediately form an opinion about something the second that you hear about it, chances are it's not a fully informed opinion. It's not fully informed in general, and you probably need to do a little bit more research about it. And this is one of those instances where it doesn't matter who it's from. It doesn't matter what the credential is of the person that is spouting off any kind of information. It is our job, especially going into nursing or nurses that are currently in the field, you have to take things and look at all of the evidence that that surrounds it before you form an opinion. Otherwise, you might look like a complete moron a lot later, and a lot of people sort of find their own ways to save face, and that's either by doubling down or just hiding in the shadows. You don't want to do that, especially if you want to be taken seriously, especially if you want the profession to be taken seriously. So again, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Earn It Podcast. We are on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts, and depending on where you're listening from, follow, subscribe, comment, like, and most importantly, share. There is a link to my LinkedIn in the description of the podcast, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if you'd like to come on and have a discussion. Again, thank you so much for listening. Go out there and earn it today.